The scripture lesson today is taken from the book of Acts, chapter 14, verses 8 through 12. In Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet and had never walked, for he had been crippled from birth. He listened to Paul as Paul was speaking, and Paul looked at him intently. And seeing that he had faith to be healed, he said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And the man sprang up and began to walk. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. This ends the scripture reading. Thanks be to God.
Dear friends, on this bright Sunday, I decided to share with you my personal testimony. And we will not start with this biblical reading. We will eventually get to it. And my nose is still filled with tears, which I am hiding or trying to hide. Personal testimony, how I got liberated from prejudice. And partly because on Tuesday, I heard your questions, how to answer homophobic arguments and how to liberate your friends or your family members or yourself. And one of the ways to liberty, I said, was by deconstructing prejudices, breaking the shackles of bad theology. You know, when I was growing up in the 1970s, not a spring chicken any longer, now you know how old I am, there was a strong and vicious prejudice against gay people. And not only here in America with all the evangelicals and so on, around the world, let us be honest. In Europe also. And the conservatives and fundamentalist Christians were, of course, using the story of Sodom and Gomorrah to argue their dreadful propaganda points. According to them, Sodom and Gomorrah was about homosexuality and nothing else. And it's, of course, in their language, punishment. Well, thankfully, I was from a medical family, and that protected me. And my grandfather was an enlightened Presbyterian minister, or they call it evangelical, but that does not translate, so take Presbyterian minister, and even a clerk of Presbyterian, or how you would call it. So I was at least partly shielded and protected from the most hateful excesses. But you know how it works. That hate and prejudice, they find their way in, sneaking, bringing some uncertainty, insecurity, doubt. Because usually the way it is being presented is so obvious. Thankfully, in the first semester in seminary, we were required to read the entire Bible. Almost like those fundamentalists, maybe so that we can trump them. It was called Practical Knowledge of the Scripture. And while reading it, we were accompanied, guided by our professors, who were asking questions here and there. And relatively early on, I came across one of those really nasty, atrocious stories, besides, of course, Sodom and Gomorrah, but those atrocious stories from the book of Judges 19, atrocity in Gibeah, or Gibeah. I mention it in my Friday message in a fuller context, and it is really nasty text, but I'll give you at least a shortened paraphrase. And don't be mad at me, it's part of Bible. A Levite is traveling with his concubine from Bethlehem to his home in Ephraim Highlands. He did not want to spend a night in Jerusalem because he is prejudiced against those who are settled there. They are still pagans, Jebusites, and so he does not want to have anything in common with them. So he is pressing on to nearby Gibeah, which belonged to the tribe of Benjamin. But when they came there, at the sunset, no one offered them hospitality for that night. Only one elderly resident is returning really almost at night, a migrant originally also from Ephraim. And he took in them for the night. He also explained that it was not safe for them to spend the night outside. And indeed, in next sentence, we hear that at that night, the local bad boys threatened the Levites' integrity and safety, and so his host offered his daughter and Levite's concubine, who were then gang raped all night. In the morning, the Levite found his concubine with her hands on the threshold of that home. The Levite took her body home, where he dismembered her corpse and used the pieces of her body to mobilize other tribes for a punitive campaign against the tribe of Benjamin. That's the story. Civil war ensues. Feminist theologian Phyllis Trible properly counted this story among the biblical texts of terror. My professor of Hebrew Bible challenged me to seek broader context, to find a biblical parallel. And with the help of simple reference tools in the Bible itself, I realized that Genesis 19 and Judges 19 are actually twin stories. The story of Sodom and the story of Gibeah are closely matched, paralleled of each other. Strangers well welcomed for a night into a home of a local outsider. Their safety, the safety of guests, was then seriously threatened and attacked, which was then followed shortly by serious consequences. And not only the storyline or outline, but even some phraseology and vocabulary are matched in between these two stories. Later, I have this simple observation confirmed by other theologians, like, for instance, here in America, quite well-known Walter Brueggemann, who in his commentary to Genesis is drawing this parallel quite closely. Interestingly, I got a number of commentaries on Judges, and they are not mentioning it. But those who are working on Genesis, they are generally mentioning it. That's good. And thus, in my first semester of theology, I was liberated from that straitjacket of prejudice. One of the nastiest biblical stories about Gibeah about that Gibeah atrocity, in fact, liberated me from the fundamentalist homophobia by observing these parallels, observing these stories side by side. It is clear that homosexuality is emphatically not the focus of these stories. In their center, the pivotal point is the violence against the strangers. These stories are about violation of the sacred obligation and rules of hospitality. And I got it further confirmed while reading already here in America an article in the peer-reviewed Journal for the Study of the Old Testament from Sheffield, which pointed out even the classical parallel from Asia Minor, today's Turkey. The story about Baucis and Philemon, which is beautifully narrated by Publius Ovidius Naso in his Metamorphoses. And you have that story in the insert of your bulletin, that purplish insert which is there. And we are not going to read it, the whole thing, no. It is about the elderly couple who offered hospitality to two traveling strangers who eventually turned out to be Zeus and Hermes. And Baucis and Philemon were rewarded for their hospitality, while the nearby city was punished for neglecting their holy duty. And that is also the religious, or if you wish, mythical background of that strange anecdote mentioned in the Acts of Apostles, which we heard. You know, that mistaken identity. Of course, Paul later goes and explains, oh, be it far from you, we are just human beings, go away from your pagan prejudice and so on. Sometimes I think that that's the Christian monotheism ideology coming through that. But wouldn't it be nicer if some within us would have a little better appreciation of those, at least some of those pagan myths, because they are teaching good thing here. That myth about Baucis and Philemon, welcoming strangers and caring for strangers and giving them protection. But this just haphazard almost mentioning it in Acts, that never being really fully understood by many commentators or readers, it only confirms how well ingrained it was in ancient society, this understanding of hospitality and duties of hospitality throughout the Asia Minor and through the Middle East. It indirectly confirms how seriously ancient people took this obligation for hospitality. Greek, it was called xenia, or xenia in English probably, welcoming strangers. In the case like in Baucis and Philemon, where they welcomed gods, it was theoxenia, welcoming gods. An exact opposite is, of course, xenophobia or xenophobia. Fear of strangers is the literal translation, but these days xenophobia is more like misoxenia, which will be hatred of strangers. That is what it is very often. Not fear of strangers, hatred of strangers. And that is how I got liberated, this liberation further confirmed. Sodom and Gomorrah is not about homosexuality, and all these stories, biblical as well as classical and further confirmed in Acts of Apostles, are about sacred obligation of hospitality and care for strangers, those others, and about serious consequences if the rules of hospitality are broken. And, friends, I find it truly poignant that those who are willfully misreading the biblical text, spreading their hateful homophobic propaganda, are also those who are more often than not those people who are abusing vulnerable strangers, persecuting LGBTQIA+ people, and persecuting also refugees and migrants and asylum seekers. Here in America, you cannot forget or not be immediately thinking of the governors of some of the states. And a month ago, just as another illustration of these things being actually combined, a month ago, the First Presbyterian Church in Douglas, Arizona, right on the border with Mexico, and St. Luke Episcopal Church in the same town, were torched and up in flames by a sociopath, a misogynist, an anti-LGBT bigot with a grudge against churches who were also working with the migrants. First we did not know, but then they caught him, arsonist, and it got confirmed that all these things I mentioned, he had a grudge against the churches where women were ministers. That's how it starts. But also the churches which affirmed LGBT people and those denominations which worked for the migrants. One wonders, don't they know that such extreme and harmful prejudice stands under divine judgment? The stories are actually telling us this. Why should fundamentalists always be the only ones who are threatening about the God's punishment? Sometimes I feel like being pulled that way myself. But going away from that, I am so thankful for my family, my parents, grandparents, my children. Thankful to my teachers and to both my denominations, to all my churches, and especially to you for showing the other way in both these areas of hateful propaganda on both areas with homophobia and xenophobia. You are teaching me new ways, and I'm thankful for that and affirming it, and that is my great joy. Extending welcome and hospitality to LGBTQIA+ people as well as to strangers. Just like we are indirectly pulled into doing by our today's biblical as well as classical readings.